Complete History of Charles Xavier, Earth 616, Part 1. Early Years. Charles Francis Xavier was the mutant son of wealthy nuclear researcher, Dr. Brian Xavier, and his wife, Sharon Xavier Marco. While gestating in his mother's womb, Charles's twin was recognized by Charles as an evil presence, and he preemptively tried to kill it with his nascent psychic abilities, causing the fetus miscarriage. After Dr. Xavier's death in an accident, Sharon married his colleague Dr. Kurt Marco, who brought his son by a previous marriage, Cain Marco, to live in their ancestral mansion. Dr. Marco favored the gentle, smart Charles over his own son, which led to Cain constantly bullying Charles and Dr. Marco secretly beating Cain. Sharon married Dr. Marco because she believed that it would be best for Charles. Charles's telepathic powers began emerging when he was still a boy, around 10, and, as he grew older, he learned to control them. Due to the immense psychic energies emanating from Charles's head, he became bald at a young age. With his powers, Charles had discovered that Dr. Marco cared only about his mother's money, admitting that he was jealous of Dr. Xavier's wealth. Dr. Marco quickly grew neglectful of Sharon, driving her to alcoholism, and abused both Sharon and Cain. Charles linked his mind to his mother's in an effort to share the abuse with her and alleviate it. Charles, on one occasion, found himself experiencing the anguished thoughts and emotions of Cain, after Cain had been beaten by his father, which only led to Cain becoming more aggressive toward him and Charles feeling Cain's pain firsthand, but the inexperienced young Charles could not control or end his contact with Cain's mind at this time. Sharon died shortly thereafter of a broken heart, leaving Charles to live with his stepfather and abusive stepbrother. Later, a fight erupted between Cain and Dr. Marco, causing some of Dr. Marco's lab equipment to explode. Mortally wounded, Dr. Marco dragged the two children out before dying, begging forgiveness for not saving Dr. Xavier when he had the chance, and telling Charles to keep his powers secret from Cain. Cain was standing over them and heard of Charles's gift, which led him to believe that Charles had invaded his thoughts deliberately. From then on, Cain regarded Xavier as his enemy. Xavier was a brilliant student, attending multiple schools throughout his educational career. He attended Bard College in his early teens and graduated from Harvard University when he was 16 years old. Intent on undertaking graduate studies, Xavier entered England's Oxford University to gain his PhD genetics, biophysics. It is at Oxford where he met and fell in love with young Scotswoman Moira Kinross. Meanwhile, Marco continued to live at the mansion. Marco grew increasingly resentful of his stepbrother's scholastic and athletic achievements, as well as his telepathic powers. Marco even pushed Xavier too far one day and the two got into a fight, which Xavier easily won. Moira and Xavier's passionate discussions on genetic mutation gave way to an equally passionate romance. While still studying at Oxford, he was confronted on campus by two mutants named Logan and Victor Creed who, upon learning that the US government was actively imprisoning mutants, were seeking to band mutants together in a common group. Xavier flat out turned Logan and Creed down, something he would grow to regret in later years. It had also been hinted that Mr. Sinister interfered with Moira and Xavier's relationship, as he was posing as a professor at Oxford at the time Xavier and Moira planned to be married, but after finishing his work at Oxford, Xavier was drafted. Having been drafted, Xavier was sent to Korea during the Korean War. There, Xavier and Marco served in the same unit. Attempting to bring back the deserting Marco, Xavier witnessed how he found the mystical ruby in the temple of Sidorak that transformed him into the superhuman juggernaut. Just then, enemy high-explosive bombardment caused a cave-in and Marco was buried under several thousand tons of rock. Xavier survived and returned to his unit. Xavier also served alongside Kitty Pryde's father, Carmen Pryde, on search and rescue missions, where he earned the nickname, the Good Shepherd. Xavier became deeply depressed after Moira broke off their engagement with no explanation. After inheriting his family's considerable wealth, Xavier began traveling abroad. After leaving the army, Xavier discovered that Moira had married her old boyfriend, Joseph MacTaggart, who abused her. While in Cairo, Egypt, Xavier met the young pickpocket, Ororo Monroe, and, while making mental contact with her, battled Amal Farouk, the Shadow King host, the first evil mutant he had ever met. This meeting led to Xavier's decision to devote his life to protecting humanity from evil mutants and safeguarding innocent mutants from human oppression, believing that both could peacefully coexist. Xavier, who acknowledged she was a mutant from her brainwaves, declined to contact Ororo at this point, not wanting to shock the young woman with the true nature of her powers. Xavier next went to Haifa, Israel to meet with the head of a clinic for traumatized Holocaust victims, Daniel Shamran, where he fell in love with the catatonic Gabrielle Haller, whom he awoke using his telepathy. He also became friends with a man calling himself Eric Magnus Laneshare, a volunteer. Magnus and Xavier held lengthy debates hypothesizing what would happen if humanity was faced with a new superpowered race of humans, unaware that Magnus himself was a mutant. While Xavier was optimistic, Magnus' experiences in the Holocaust led him to believe that humanity would ultimately oppress the new race of humans, as they had done with other minorities. The two friends revealed their powers to each other when they fought Nazi Baron von Strucker and his Hydra agents, who kidnapped Gabrielle because she knew the location of their secret cache of gold. Magnus attempted to kill von Strucker, but Xavier stopped him. Realizing that his and Xavier's views on mutant-human relations were incompatible, Magnus left with the gold. Xavier stayed in Israel for some time, but he and Haller were unaware when he left that she was pregnant with his son, who would become the autistic mutant known as Legion, and they separated on good terms. In a strange town near the Himalayas, Xavier encountered an alien calling himself Lucifer, the advance scout for an invasion by his race, and foiled his plans. In retaliation, Lucifer dropped a huge stone block on Xavier, crippling his legs. Xavier was freed by Sage, who had heard his telepathic cries for help. Unfortunately, the rock had permanently damaged his legs, rendering them unusable. Xavier went into a deep depression after losing the use of his legs, and Amelia Vaught, a young American nurse, made cheering him up her pet project. Amelia helped Xavier recover during his convalescence in Bombay, India, wherein the two fell in love. While living in an apartment together in Bombay, Amelia found Xavier's notes of a device, called Cerebro, that could detect mutants. Amelia fought with Xavier, believing that he only wanted her as an experiment, stopping only when he used his power to speak to her telepathically, telling her that he loved her. Realizing that he, too, was a mutant, the couple grew very close and Xavier continued his dream with Amelia by his side. Xavier worked with fellow mutation expert, Dr. Carl Lykos, as well as Dr. Moira MacTaggart, who built a mutant research center on Muir Island, again. Apparently, Charles had gotten over Moira in his travels to the Greek island of Kyrinos. Xavier renewed his friendship with Moira, who was now a renowned geneticist, and they began discussing the idea of founding a school for mutants. Xavier discussed his candidates for recruitment to his personal strike force, the X-Men, with Dr. MacTaggart, including those he passed over, which were Kurt Wagner, Pyotr Rasputin, Pietro, and Wanda Maximoff, and Ororo. Professor Xavier's first student was the 11-year-old Jean Grey, who had been traumatized when she telepathically experienced the emotions of a dying friend. Over the years, Xavier made a name for himself as geneticist and psychologist, renowned enough that the Greys were referred to him when no other expert could help their catatonic daughter, Jean. Professor Xavier helped Jean recover and taught her to use her telekinetic powers. Professor Xavier also trained Tessa to spy on Sebastian Shaw and built a machine for Jamie Madrox to learn at home, instead of going to school. Professor Xavier later met with Fred Duncan, an FBI agent investigating the growing number of mutants. Professor Xavier told Duncan of his plan to locate young mutants and enroll them in his school for gifted youngsters, using his ancestral mansion home as a base to train them to use their powers, as well as provide them conventional educations, for humanity's benefit. The base included subterranean medical labs, a training facility called the Danger Room, an aircraft hangar with a stratojet, and Professor Xavier's mutant detection device, codenamed Cerebro. Amelia stayed with Professor Xavier, partially because she loved him, but also to convince him to give up his nonsense idea. On the anniversary of his liberation from the Vernichtung extermination camp, Professor Xavier and Amelia met with Eric, now calling himself Magneto and wearing a costume and helmet designed to shield from telepathy, in Auschwitz, Poland. Professor Xavier pleaded with Magneto that the actions he would set into motion were no different than what the Nazis did to him years earlier. After both men reminded each other that they had the power to destroy one another, Magneto left, with Professor Xavier hoping that he saw the error of his ways. Amelia left Professor Xavier as Scott Summers moved into the mansion, believing the best solution to the mutant problem being for mutants to lay low. Professor Xavier tried to force her to stay with his mental powers, but, immediately ashamed by this, let her go. Over the following months, Professor Xavier assembled his original team of X-Men, Scott, who took the name Cyclops, Iceman, Angel, Beast, and Jean, who took the name Marvel Girl. The first menace they would face was Xavier's old friend Magneto, now a mutant supremacist, and his Brotherhood of Evil Mutants. After training them for several years, Professor Xavier went underground from all of his original students, save Jean, to prepare for the invasion of the alien Xenox, and had the reformed and dying villain, Changeling, posing as him after giving him a portion of his telepathic power. The X-Men disbanded after Changeling was killed by Grotesque, and Professor Xavier left all of his belongings to Scott. Professor Xavier returned with Havoc and Lorna Dane to stop the invasion of the Xenox, where Professor Xavier probed every human mind on the planet and was left in a weakened state, and was revived using a device created by Bruce Banner. Years later, when most of his original students were captured by the mutant island Krakow, Professor Xavier sent another team comprised of Dr. MacTaggart's students, Kid Vulcan, who was Cyclops' unknown brother, Petra, Darwin, and Sway, all of whom he gave quick, mental combat experience, to rescue them. Professor Xavier also approached Emma, to be the team's telepath, but she refused and the professor erased the event from her memory. After the team freed Cyclops and Kid Vulcan revealed their connection, the entire team was seemingly killed. Cyclops escaped, but, when he made it back to Professor Xavier, the professor wiped the traumatizing knowledge that his newfound brother had died, saving him from Cyclops' memories. Professor Xavier assembled another team of X-Men, including Banshee, former Factor 3 operative, Colossus, Nightcrawler, Storm, Sunfire, Thunderbird, and Wolverine to rescue the others on Krakow, never revealing anything about Dr. MacTaggart's students. The mission was successful and the team stayed together, save Sunfire. Their next mission was to stop Count Nefaria and his Oni men, during which Thunderbird was killed attempting to stop Count Nefaria's escape. The team went on to battle Kiarak and Professor Xavier was captured by Stephen Lang's Sentinels and taken to his space station, until his X-Men rescued him. After, Professor Xavier stayed with a weak Jean in the hospital, after she had piloted the shuttle back to Earth and declared herself the Phoenix. At this time, Professor X had somehow also gained access of a Rs-150 Blackbird from SHIELD, as the X-Men's new transportation Lilandra Naramani, princess of the alien Shi'ar race. And the woman he shared an intense psychic bond with across the vast distance that separated their two planets, came to Earth to implore Professor Xavier for his help against her mad, tyrannical brother, Deacon Naramani, and he, instantly, aided her by deploying his X-Men. They, then, journeyed to the M'Kron Crystal's home world to battle the Shi'ar Imperial Guard. After briefly battling Weapon Alpha and, later, Warhawk Phoenix returned from the Savage Land to tell Professor X that all the X-Men were dead. Professor Xavier shut down the school and traveled with Lilandra to her kingdom, where she was crowned Empress. Professor Xavier dreamed of her and Lilandra knew they were soulmates. They fell in love and, for a time, Professor Xavier lived on Chandila, the Shi'ar throne world, as Lilandra's consort. Professor Xavier returned to Earth and resumed his position at the school. Professor X then located Kitty Pryde with Cerebro. Professor Xavier and 3 of the X-Men, Colossus, Storm, and Wolverine set out for Deerfield, Illinois to contact her and possibly recruit her as a member of the X-Men. Unknown to Professor Xavier, the mercenary, Warhawk, had planted a device that enabled his employers in the inner circle of the Hellfire Club to monitor Cerebro's activities. The inner circle, thus, also learned about Kitty, and one of its leaders, Emma, now the White Queen, also went to contact her. The X-Men then went on to battle the Hellfire Club while attempting to recruit Dazzler. When trying to understand the motives of the Hellfire Club, Angel set up an invite to a Hellfire Club party, where the Phoenix fell under Mastermind and the Hellfire Club's control and transformed into the Black Queen after the X-Men battled the Hellfire Club's inner circle. Phoenix underwent another transformation into the Dark Phoenix and soared through the universe, where she devoured an entire star and the 5 billion inhabitants of one of its planets. When Phoenix returned to Earth, she threatened to kill everyone, but Professor X was able to keep Phoenix under control and helped her will herself back to normal. The X-Men were then teleported away by the Shi'ar. The Shi'ar Empire had witnessed Dark Phoenix consuming the star and Professor Xavier had no other choice but to challenge the Shi'ar Imperial Guard to a duel over the fate of the Phoenix. The battle triggered her transformation into Dark Phoenix once more and she understood that she would never be able to fully control the dark hunger inside and sacrificed herself on the moon. Jean Grey was believed dead. The team went on to battle the Sentinels and during a coup, first met the alien brood and battled Deathbird and Admiral Samedar to restore Lilandra to the Shi'ar throne, where Professor Xavier was sent into a coma unknown to anyone. Professor X had been implanted with a brood queen egg at the time Professor X woke from his coma to learn that his X-Men and Lilandra had left him. Around this time, Professor X aided Spider-Man in battling Mentallo and was unable to rebuild Anthony Power's son, Matthew's comatose mind. Professor Xavier was able to help Dr. Lycos, who had been trapped as Sauron. Professor X found that Dr. Lycos was infected with a genetic virus that mutated him and isolated the alien element in his DNA matrix, which cured him. After a call from Reed Richards about a powerful, young mutant whose powers were out of control and with encouragement by Dr. MacTaggart, Professor Xavier took Xian Koiman to his mansion and Dr. MacTaggart also brought her foster daughter, Ronnie Sinclair. Donald Pierce was determined to kill Professor Xavier, as well as other superhuman mutants, and had Danielle Moonstar's grandfather, Black Eagle, murdered. Professor Xavier and the girls went to Moonstar's aid. After Danny joined the others, rescued Roberto da Costa and Samuel Guthrie. After being captured by Pierce, the youths rescued Professor X and he decided to take on a new class of mutant students whom he aptly named the New Mutants. Professor Xavier also employed a small staff to help with the raising of the students, beginning with the human Stevie Hunter, and Xian, as the school's secretary. Professor Xavier initially had brought the team together to use as embryos as a brood queen was slightly influencing him. After mysteriously trapping Psyche in the danger room, Professor X used her powers to attack the New Mutants. The X-Men returned from space with the knowledge that Professor X had been infected with an embryo and the Brood Queen revealed herself by transforming him. The mind of Professor Xavier asserted long enough to ask Cyclops to kill him, but Cyclops declined. Dr. MacTaggart and the X-Men's spacefaring allies, the Starjammers, saved Professor Xavier by transferring his mind into a newly cloned, somewhat younger body in which his legs functioned. The experience made Professor Xavier feel like a whole man, but his legs were having trouble working. After Professor X had a televised debate with Reverend William Stryker, he, Scott, and Aurora were kidnapped by the Purifiers. While in captivity, Professor X was hooked to a machine operated by Dr. Philip Ramsey, attempting to turn him against mutants with illusions of the X-Men killing him and Reverend Stryker saving him. After Professor X was brainwashed, he fired mental bolts at Scott and Aurora, seemingly killing them, and Stryker had him taken to Madison Square Garden, where he was attached to a machine that, using his brain power, would kill all living mutants. Magneto, with his psi-shielded helmet, was able to distract the professor enough for the X-Men to destroy the machine. Later at the mansion, Professor admitted that Magneto was right and began to accept his offer to join until Scott stopped him and stated that he believed in the professor's dream and will see it come true. Professor X declined his offer and Magneto left, calling them fools. At the return of the X-Men, Professor Xavier, initially, demoted Kitty Pryde, Sprite, to the New Mutants, an act that enraged her, until Kitty impressed him by defeating two Sidri. With the help of Lockheed while attending a fair, the New Mutants were attacked by Viper and the Silver Samurai and Psyche was kidnapped. Professor Xavier decided to aid Team America and the New Mutants left without his permission to save Danny. Xian was lost to the New Mutants to an explosion. Sensing the Shadow King in Xian's disappearance, Professor Xavier ordered the New Mutants to a vacation. Rogue came to Professor Xavier asking for help with her multiple personalities. Professor Xavier accepted her into his school and the X-Men, Even after all the X-Men and Binary stated they would quit if she was admitted, and the team reluctantly agreed. Professor Xavier and Lilandra continuously tried to understand why he felt intense pain every time he would attempt to walk, and she stated that she would soon have to leave to stop her sister from starting a war in her kingdom. After battling Mastermind again, Professor Xavier hosted Cyclops' first marriage to Madeline Pryor at his mansion home. Professor Xavier, later, bid farewell to his love, Lilandra, as she returned to Shi'ar space with the Starjammers, and the X-Men battled the Brotherhood, as Mystique attempted to rescue Rogue from the X-Men, thinking Xavier forced her leave from the Brotherhood, only to have Rogue tell her that she joined of her own free will. Professor Xavier shocked everyone with the full use of his legs. Professor Xavier maintained his principle of never rejecting a troubled soul and, after rescuing Rachel Summers from Selene, Professor X scanned her and welcomed her to his school and the X-Men. After the New Mutants battled a demon bear, Professor X invited Sharon Friedlander and Tom Corsi, 2 more humans, to work at his school. After returning to a ruined home, Professor X allowed Warlock to join the New Mutants. At this time, Professor X took a visiting professorship in genetics at Columbia University, where he was beaten by a hate crime-driven, anti-mutant group of students, and Professor X was slightly healed by the Morlock healer. Professor X and the X-Men, next, battled Thunderbird, brother to the original Thunderbird, and blaming Professor Xavier for his brother's death, and the Hellions to rescue Banshee. Professor X, eventually, convinced Thunderbird that his brother died a hero's death, and he released them, stating Professor Xavier was an honorable man. To rescue Banshee, the X-Men had to infiltrate the NORAD, North American Aerospace Defense Command, and the X-Men were officially outlawed after repeated assaults. From publicly announcing she was a mutant, Dazzler returned to Professor X and asked for training in the Danger Room. After her training, Professor X provided her with a new uniform that amplified and gave precision to her powers. Professor X met with his former lover, Gabrielle, on Muir Island and discovered that he was her teenage son's father. The autistic boy, David Haller, suffered from multiple personality disorder and had vast psionic powers beyond his father. After helping him and the New Mutants to escape from David's mind, Professor Xavier promised he would always be there for him.